All right, thank you very much, Jesse. Like she stated, we're going to be talking about machine learning for automated analysis, specifically with 3D neutron scattering data. So I'd like to go over just a quick bit of history. Neutron scattering has been a topic that's been studied for quite a long time. Here I'm showing a paper by Schull, Wolin, and Kohler about the benefits of neutron scattering. These are scientists that were a part of Oak Ridge National Lab. You can see that they determined it's quite favorable in different aspects, such as the polarization, the beam intensity, and just the ease of obtaining these neutrons. I do like to show this nice picture of Ernest Wolin and Clifford Schull working in the lab in a nice three-piece suit, as we all know every scientist does. So it's been quite a long history, but first of all, why are we even looking at neutron scattering? There's a lot of other particles we can use, right? Many of you probably have heard of X-rays. So X-ray scattering is really good at probing low Z materials and are mainly scattered by electrons within a material. You've probably had an X-ray on your hand or jaw before, or any other body part. It can shoot right through your tissue and you can see broken bones and things like that. Other particles, so we can have a electron scattering experiment, which is also good for low Z materials, and it's actually quite strongly interacting, so it can probe the electron shell of different materials. But these are not always something you want. The benefits of neutrons are that they're weakly interacting. So neutrons will mainly either pass straight through the material you're going to be working with, or if it does scatter, it'll scatter with a single atomic nuclei and then move forward at an angle. These neutrons, likewise, can penetrate much more than X-rays or electrons. So if you have a sample that's hidden by either the container that's holding it, or it's going to be sort of hidden from our view, neutrons are a good aspect of probing this material. So here I want to just show a quick pictograph of what we're going to be looking at. Let's say you have an incoming instant beam of neutrons. They're just going to move at some momentum k. They'll either, they can move straight through this sample here and just move in a straight line, or they could do a simple scattering at some angle theta, and then it'll have this new momentum. What we're actually going to be measuring here is the difference in momentum of those two interactions. So this detector is going to be measuring what's called Q space or momentum space. And all it is just the difference in these momentum values. And we'll be talking about that a lot as we move through the talk. But what are we actually working with? So we're in a collaboration with Oak Ridge National Lab. We're specifically working with the TOPAZ single crystal diffractometer. You can see a picture of it here. The neutrons will come from a source down here and they move along this beam line and then interact with the sample that's inside this detector. We also have a nice diagram of the with the top view. So your sample is going to sit in the center here. It'll be bombarded with neutrons. They will scatter at some angle, and then these detectors in the array or outside of the sample are going to be measuring this momentum of the scattered neutrons. And the nice thing about the TOPAZ experiment is that you can rotate your sample within the beam and get different measurements or aspects of the lattice of the particular crystal that you're looking at. This detector also has a wide variety of controls. Namely, you can cool the crystal down. You can go all the way to 5 Kelvin with a helium cooling element, or you can even heat it up all the way to 450 Kelvin. So you can get a broad array of measurements for your sample. And because of this rotations and the array of the detectors, you can get a broad measurement in what's called Q coverage, or just a broad measurement in momentum space for your crystal. So how do we analyze this data? Current analysis methods are using a software called Mantid. It's an open source community developed application. It's taking raw data from your detector and looking at 2D slices of this 3D data. So here's a nice picture of what this is. So you have a 3-dimensional volume and take arbitrary 2D slices through this volume and you analyze the data from there. There are some difficulties with analyzing data like this. First of all, you could have very large data sets up to 100 gigabytes, and this can limit the interactivity with Mantid. Displaying that much data requires first a high level of user interaction. So Mantid requires a lot of user input in order to have accurate methods. And unfortunately, these 2D slices, while it's taking some information from this three-dimensional space, you have the possibility of missing key features of the data. So you're slicing along an axis or some frame, and you could miss some clusters of neutrons in your data that could give you some insight into what you're looking at. And also, with this much data, you have the possibility of running slow due to potential shortfalls in optimization. So how can we hopefully improve this? Well, the main thing is machine learning. Machine learning is very good at reducing user interaction. You can have a system that's running without any user input, and we're going to look at methods where we are able to identify what is called Bragg peaks, which is basically all of these bright clusters you see throughout the system here. What we want to do with this is, once we have an automated way to identify these Bragg peaks, we are in collaboration with NVIDIA using NVIDIA GPUs and specifically their index software, which allows for real-time visualization of this data. So Mantid is more of an offline analysis. You take all your data and you analyze it offline. But with index and this machine learning implementation, we should be able to have a real-time visualization where we can move the data around in this 3D space, and also use the machine learning to identify all the interesting features that we're going to be looking at. So how are we implementing these machine learning methods? Well, let's take an example of looking at scattering data from a single silicon crystal. We first need to do a little bit of pre-processing the data. The data from TOPAZ comes as more of a list of particle events which have a momentum measurement and an intensity. We take all those measurements and project them onto a three-dimensional mesh, which you can see here. So all of these single points are going to be a input of intensity, and it has a momentum location in z, x, y, and z. The data can be quite difficult to process. We're actually going to use a DB scan method, which is a density-based clustering algorithm. The nice thing about this methodology is that it is very good at identifying oblong clusters. So you don't necessarily have a perfectly spherical cluster that you want to identify. You could have something that is more difficult, but still going to be a cluster of interest. So it's very good at identifying that. And also it is quite good at removing noise. So you can see the regions of interest. So these dots are going to be clusters of cells, clusters of neutrons that we have deemed to be interest, which are called Bragg peaks. And then these scattering diffuse points are going to be, they're still neutrons, but they're more of a wide spread of neutrons that aren't correlating to something that we're interested in. So we're able to take that and subtract the noise and get what we find here. I should mention, so why are there even these peaks, these dots showing up? If you remember from your time learning physics, a particle can also be thought of as a wave. So you could have a neutron moving down a beamline. It has some wavelength, and as it scatters to a new wavelength, and you'll get either a constructive or deconstructive interference of this wavelength. And what we know from these peaks is that they're going to be all the constructive interferences that give us a physical interpretation of our crystal. And then these other diffuse background, while it's not deconstructive, it is still not as highly peaked as these other clusters that are of interest. And so we have a way to cluster this data without human interaction. It's an all fully automated method. But how do we know it's actually good? Well, we want to compare these clusters that we've identified with what Mantid would decide. There's a little bit of a theoretical aside here. So this equation at the bottom, this QS, is going to be all the measured Q space peaks, or all those points in that array, in the lattice that I just showed. Those are all just measured. The machine learning methods will measure them. The Mantid methods will measure them. Those are all just found within the data. You're then able to do a fast Fourier transform, which could calculate this UV matrix. It's really just an orientation matrix for the lattice. And then you can invert this equation, and you can predict these what are called Miller indices, and theoretically these should all be integers, but they could definitely have a wide array of values. So what would we actually compare here? We're measuring these. Well, okay, let's compare the fast Fourier transform calculation of the matrix. Well, turns out it's not as straightforward. Due to the crystal lattice symmetry, you could rotate it by some angle and still get the exact same predicted peaks out. So it's not necessarily a unique matrix. So it seems like that's not a quite as good method. Well, what if we compare the Miller indices? So all of these HKL vectors or indices should be an integer value. Well, if we try to predict these, we could see how close are they to an integer? Well, because of, again, this rotation, you can get a completely different integer value, which would correspond to the exact same Bragg peak. So it's not necessarily a unique method either. Well, instead, we are going to start looking at the actual locations of these peaks in Q space, and then we want to calculate a confidence level for all of these peaks. So what do I mean by doing that? Well, here is an actual comparison of this. So if we look at this plot at the bottom, the red dots here are going to be all of the actual data. So these are all neutrons that were measured by the detector, and they all are in this Q space frame. And if you see, there is an obvious cluster. There's a nice, it's fairly circular, but kind of oblong cluster that a human, if you're analyzing this data, would probably identify as a peak of interest. You would say, like, this is probably a Bragg peak. We should measure the data here or calculate what the center of this peak is. Well, Mantid, this green circle, after running on the data itself, was able to identify that, yes, that is indeed a Bragg peak. And when calculating the center, it does seem that the center is in the center of this cluster, which is what we would expect and what we like to have confirmation of. On this same data set, I ran Mantid to allow it to find all the peaks that it could find. And then I calculated the center of those. And you can see that Mantid is a bit off center. It did decide that it was a peak, but it is not exactly in the center of the cluster as one would like. So we want to have a way to quantify which peak is going to be the most correct peak. How we're going to do this is by having a signal to noise ratio. So you can look at the amount of information that's really close to the peak and compare it to just the total amount of noise around it. Ideally, a Bragg peak would have a ratio greater than 5. We are working on ways to take that and identify a confidence mapping for each of these. And this is ongoing work at the moment. So we can actually get into a demo working with this. So at Radiusoft, we have a nice software environment called Cerepo. If you go to cerepo.com, you'll see this nice page. And this is a open source this is a free methodology where you can actually start simulation for different codes. So if I was to press this here, I can see I can start a simulation with a code called Activate or something called Genesis, a code called Shadow. But what we're going to be working with is a code called actually just Jupyter Notebooks. So if I open up here, I have a question. Where should we go with that? Have you determined where the disagreement between Mantid and dbScan arises? Is it from the tools or instead inherent in the different calculation methods? So there is a difference in the calculation methods. So if I, well, that's the summary. For dbScan, it's really looking at the distance to its nearest neighbor. And so this is a parameter that you can optimize. It's really, it starts at a location and it'll cluster everything near it as a cluster as long as it's within some sort of distance of what's called a neighborhood. Mantid will run more of like an integration shell where it starts at a point and it starts integrating outward this shell of intensities. And once it gets to a certain amount of intensity within the shell, it decides that it's going to be a Bragg peak. So there's a little bit different methodology, but we do want to determine which one's going to give us the most accurate value. Okay, so once I launch Cerepo, and specifically the Jupyter Notebook, I am prompted with a bunch of different things I could do. I can either start a notebook working on Python 3 or even a manted Python implementation, or I can even do things like look at the terminal. So this goes to my main area. I have already opened up some sample scripts. The main libraries we're going to be working with is a data frame manager in Python called Pandas. It's a great way for organizing data and reading through and doing different analyses. NumPy, which is a great mathematical framework for doing matrix operations for data within Python. And then looking at different, we have an scikit-learn implementation, which is down here, which is the library that has the dbScan clustering algorithm implemented within it. So the nice thing about Jupyter Notebooks is that you can run each of these cells individually. There is no particular order. You can rerun cells as much as you want. But let's go ahead and start running the cells, or if I am not able to run this one, okay. So my kernel seemed to have shut down, but it was very easy to start again by pressing this double arrow button here. I'm able to load all my libraries, and then I can read in my data file as this data frame that I'm calling voxels. I like to do some initial pre-analysis to just see what kind of data I'm working with. So I like to plot the intensity of all of these peaks. So you can see that there's a large number of, not peaks, sorry, the intensity of all of these clusters within this three-dimensional space. You can see there are a lot of them that are a really low intensity. So a neutron went through the material and either scattered at a very small angle to where that delta Q, the Q is a very small value, which you do expect to have a lot of those. And then a lot of interesting data where you have a high intensity, which is going to be what the Bragg peaks we're interested in. Below here is the actual implementation of the dbScan algorithm. This takes a little bit to run. You can see it just finished. I'm actually going to move over to another notebook where I've already executed all of these cells so we can look at them in a more timely format. So dbScan has a different set of parameters that you can include to try to optimize how you're going to cluster. Like I mentioned before, it looks at really the distance to the nearest neighbor, and as long as it's within this sort of distance, it'll cluster them all together in what's called a neighborhood within the framework, but really I'm calling them clusters. And so I've optimized that value here, and then I really just want to set a minimum number of samples that I'm going to say is like, as long as it's more than this, it can be a cluster. And all I'm saying is that's 2. It's kind of a minimum working order. It could be a larger value depending on the analysis that you're going to do. And since we're ideally looking for these Bragg peaks, which are going to be high intensity clusters of neutron data, we want the dbScan to preferentially look for that. So we're going to include this intensity of the neutrons as part of the weight of the clustering, which is this parameter here. And so once it goes through the clustering, I can actually see the results out. So after doing this, I identified, it automatically identified 256 clusters, which we're going to hopefully think are Bragg peaks. And then a estimated number of noise points, which there's about 2.2 million noise points. And so you can see there's quite a bit of noise that we have to work through just to get to the interesting data that we would like. I am looking at, the nice thing about Pandas is that I can easily alter and change the data in such a way that makes it easier to analyze. Just for the purposes of making it easier to plot, I'm taking the full data set and just removing the weight that is below 0.25. So if you look here, there's the normalized intensity, and I'm really just removing all of the neutron cells that are in this region. This is just to make the ease of the 3D plotting easier later. If I were to include those plots, it would just take a lot longer to execute. But the main thing is this line here. The nice thing about dbScan is that it'll label all of these noise points with a specific ID. And with the Pandas data frame, I can easily cut them out of my data. And so that's what I've done here with this data frame. So we can look at, ooh, what a fun time. Let's see if this actually, okay, perfect. Okay, so here I'm plotting the fully clustered data with its noise involved, just with an intensity of greater than 0.25. And you can see, while we did find a lot of clusters, there is a lot of noisy background that we don't necessarily want to analyze. So you can see there's probably things that a person would identify, that the algorithm identified this as being a cluster. This is also a cluster. We can see various clusters throughout the data, but we want to remove this from our we want to remove the noise from our actual data set. So I've already done that, and that's just got this name voxels db. So once I include that, as you can see, very easy to remove all the noisy data sets. You can see these are actually, they're not just singular points, they're clusters of points. And so you can see it takes a little bit of getting used to the plotting here. And so we can see a lot of clusters that have interesting parameters that we would like to see. I've gone through this and actually identified a specific point that is a Bragg peak, and plotting the point here, you can see, while it's not circular, it's got a bit of an oblong shape, but that's the nice thing about Mantid, is you can easily find this. And I'm plotting the colors here is actually going to be the intensity. And so we can see that the most intense portions of this Bragg peak are going to be in the center here. You can see that it's kind of a yellowish color. It might be difficult to see on the video. But once we take that, we can do further analysis with our framework and calculate all those things like the UV matrix and the Miller indices from there. So just as a very quick summary, we do have a method to automatically find these Bragg peaks with a density-based clustering algorithm. It doesn't need any user interaction. You just press a button and let it run on your data set, and we can calculate various interesting physics parameters from this data. The nice thing about this is that we can then easily remove noise, and we're working on methods to either have a signal noise fit to have a confidence level for these identified clusters. I did mention a little bit before, but for our future work, we're in collaboration with NVIDIA, working with specifically NVIDIA GPUs, but also working with their software called Index, which is an interactive visualization software. It should be able to stream in the data from the experiment in real time and allow for an interactive three-dimensional interpretation of the data. But we can also implement this dbScan algorithm as it's running and identify these Bragg peaks in real time. And this should allow for an easier analysis from scientists at Oak Ridge. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. That was a great presentation. We have a couple questions queued up here for you. Thank you for handling that previous question on the fly. The first one we have lined up is, why are neutrons better at analyzing materials at ultra low temperatures?
Yes, so that is right. It says beneficial for studying materials near zero. It's not that neutrons are specifically better at cold temperatures. It's that to get your sample to a low temperature, you have to have it in a container that is able to cool it. And typically X-rays and electrons would not be able to penetrate that container. But neutrons, since they're weakly interacting, could easily penetrate through and interact with the sample on the inside.
Excellent, thank you. Next question we have is there any background that the dbScan is not able to remove?
Yes, so I did show here, this is only silicon, which in the crystallography world is like the hello world of crystallography. There are much more complex samples. The one that comes to mind is benzyl. It does have this diffuse, this background structure here, which is noise, which we would like to remove, but it also has a diffuse structure that is not necessarily Bragg peaks, but it's different interactions along the different Miller indice planes within the crystal. These are of interest for other physics analyses, but it's not specifically what we're looking into. So the clustering algorithm, it clusters those together, and that's why we're working on different signal to noise methods of identifying a confidence level on if a cluster is really a Bragg peak or if it's just this other background of interest.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. We're just coming up on 30 minutes here, so
Yeah.
we're kind of at the ceiling of our time. And oh, wait, we go.
But there is a question. So could I start
Yeah,
with
there is
the
one more,
data's
sorry.
normalized too? So
Yeah.
yes, you saw here the intensity. This is a normalized intensity. So as the neutrons are bombarding their sample, they'll scatter at some angle and have a measured Q intensity. In order to integrate this with NVIDIA's index, we run through the data, we project it onto the three-dimensional mesh, but we also look at the intensities and normalize them. And that's because the color mapping, which is, I have that, this color mapping here, this scale only goes from 0 to 1. So we scan through, look at all the intensities, we find the maximum, and then take that maximum and divide it by all intensities to make everything normalized to 1. It's for ease of plotting within NVIDIA's index visualization.
Great. All right. The last question we have is more of a comment, and it is great talk, Matt. Good work, which I think is a really fun way to bring it to a close today. So thank you everyone for coming to our webinar. Please check your emails in a week or so, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording of this. And thank you again to Dr. Matt Kilpatrick for putting us in a great place here. Thanks, Matt.
All right, thanks.